All right, today we are looking at the Cooler Master H500P. Okay, we're not gonna. So this is the Cooler Master H500P. It is not officially called a high airflow case, but all of the materials we've been given in the reviewer's guide and presumably in marketing materials publicly has made references to high airflow design, which obviously it is a bit of a callback to the half series. One of the biggest cases I've ever worked with was the Half X, and this is the first major return to what is kind of a spiritual successor to the Half line for Cooler Master, though it's not really truly a high airflow case because it's got all the paneling. So it has an acrylic panel on the front, acrylic panel on the top, and then tempered glass on the side. So it is a bit of a departure, but that's why this now falls under the MasterCase series rather than an official half series. But it is the H500P and obviously is a throwback. Before that, this is brought to you by the EVGA 240 CLC, which is a $120 MSRP closed loop liquid cooler. The EVGA 240 CLC has an RGB illuminated pump plate, uses a thermal probe within the lower pump chamber for liquid temperature monitoring, and allows customization through software. Learn more at the link in the description below. The case itself is flawed in a lot of ways. I'll admit, both Patrick and I were disappointed in this case when we got it, and we had much higher hopes just because of what we'd seen at Computex and later on at other shows. But the thing is, all those events, we never got hands-on time building with the thing. So you learn a lot about a case when you actually build in it, and it's not just a display case. So that says a lot about the configuration here. It clearly is appealing to people. This is the most hyped case since really any case I can remember recently. In fact, the H500P has gotten more hype in the industry in terms of new products, probably than Vega and to some extent even Coffee Lake. I mean, videos with this case have gotten more views than GPU and CPU reviews. That's absurd and really speaks to something about the case, partly marketing, but they haven't done a ton of marketing. So a lot of it is building on an existing brand, Half, bringing it back after absence for so long, and having something that obviously looks pretty good on camera. That's what they've done well here. What they haven't done as well is a lot of other things. For example, this panel is less of a concern than the front panel, but the front panel, if you pick it up, touching the front panel, it probably will come out. So, I mean, once again, just to kind of illustrate this, there's the front panel. The way this mounts, instead of having the normal alligator clips like pretty much any other case on the market, they have hooks on the bottom, and then they've got these that don't clip into anything. They just kind of sit there. Also, it creaks like a McDonald's toy in terms of plastic quality. So, yeah, not the best quality materials on the panel in general. I mean, just nothing about the panel is quality. Nothing about this panel is quality. So Cooler Master's cheaped out in a few places with this case that are really just disappointing, especially considering the hype around it. And a lot of the hype does come back to, we'll just leave that like that, looks fine. A lot of hype comes back to these fans. These are 200mm fans that have more or less been absent since previous high airflow design cases from Cooler Master. They just kind of died. And 200mm fans are hard to make. First of all, there are 3 or 4 different specs for 200mm fans in terms of hole spacing. And some of them were 180, some were 200. There was like a weird one in between there somewhere, like a 193 or something. There's a 220. So there were a lot of different specs, and no one agreed on it, which made them fall out of popularity. They have a lot more weight in terms of just the blade, so you need a more robust motor in the middle and bearing. And they're expensive. And if you do a cheap one, it's just not going to perform well at all. So this is a return. It's gotten a lot of interest. These things also suffer a bit with static pressure, and because of that, you're positioned behind an acrylic panel. Obviously, no air comes through here, but the side ventilation looks pretty sufficient. It's actually about an inch or so of ventilation, and in our testing in the past, we found that's pretty much what you need to get good airflow with a case that blocks off front ventilation like the S340 or HV440 V2, where they breathe only from the side of the front panel. So that's generally sufficient. However, if you notice, these are actually mounted to the outside of the frame, the chassis, and because they're mounted to the outside of the chassis, actually less than half an inch of this, the width of one finger, is what the fans can breathe through. So most of the air ends up coming in through the top, through the bottom, and oddly, there's sort of a skirt down here that's mesh. A bit of it comes through there as well. This skirt wasn't there at Computex. I don't know if it was added later, but air comes through there, and that's kind of a filter to some extent. So they've got a serious airflow problem for being something that calls back to high airflow. We'll be talking about that in the thermal section. That's much less of a problem, though, than the build quality. The thermal problem is basically, it just puts it middle of the road. I won't spoil all the charts, but that's kind of where it goes. The build quality, this is stuff you only deal with lifting up the case probably once or twice, and once you figure out that the panel's loose like this, it's not going to bother you again. You've learned it, you're not gonna get stunned twice by it. So it's less of a thing to complain about, but it's still just like, why? And we asked that question. We asked, why wouldn't you do even just a cheap alligator clip made out of plastic? And the answer is basically Cooler Master's planning things for this case for the future that we can't talk about yet. But I still disagree with the decision, even with those future plans. The top panel, more or less the same thing in terms of build quality, just kind of, I don't know, this one much less of an issue than the front panel, but they are cheaper materials, and that's disappointing to see. I do really like the top frame for radiator and fan mounting. They've done that well. The fact that there's a frame up here to mount separately means you can really easily go through everything and install it. And that's good. The fans look good on the front as well. They've got a 140 in the back, I think. Yeah, that helps with exhausting the heat. And there's a vertical GPU mount following the trend. There's tempered glass following the trend. The fans are RGB. So they've done a lot of things kind of right, but they've also done a lot of things wrong. And I mean, on the good, let's go through the good quickly. Fans look good. Looks in general obviously are subjective, but a lot of you have expressed interest and desire in this design that they've got, despite the quality of materials. When you touch it, it is again a bit cheap, like McDonald's toy plastic, but it looks okay, and you're probably not going to be touching it more than just to build. So we can try to brush that away to make room for other bigger complaints. It's got a power supply shroud that can be removed in pieces, so that's nice. You can more easily work with it. The bad, a lot of stuff I've gone through already. In addition to the other stuff we've talked about, there's no RGB controller despite I/O panel preparation for it. There are actually fake buttons up here for RGB cycling, similar to the C700P buttons, but they don't actually work. There's no controller. You could buy one for 20 bucks from Alzai or something like that, but otherwise you basically have to plug it into a motherboard. Not every motherboard is going to have RGB lighting headers. It's getting more popular now, so we'll kind of, again, brush that one a bit aside as a small complaint that's not really worth much in the grand scheme of things. The tempered glass panel, though, I do have a bone to pick with. It's wobbly like crazy. Like, this is, I'm just kind of pushing on it here, and see that? Like, this is kind of absurd, and the reason this happens is because the panel is mounted with a screw, which, by the way, is already losing its finish. It's getting kind of copper colored in there. It's mounted by the screw. It's just a turn, so it's a hinge or a latch. It's not actually threaded. And so you turn it 90 degrees and the panel loosens, and then it's latched or hinged down at the bottom as well. And ultimately what this means is they've got fewer screws in the panel, though there's one dead center now, so it's more noticeable anyway. Fewer screws in the panel, it lets them hinge the door rather than just kind of mount it on 4 rails and then the panel would fall off like you see on a lot of the other cases on the market. So they've kind of fixed that problem. Inwin does it way better with the Inwin 303 we reviewed previously. This one, because of the way it's mounted and secured, there's not enough mounting pressure, so the panel wobbles, and it also protrudes from the case and isn't flush with the panel. So it protrudes by, I don't know, about 3 or 4 millimeters. And once we reassemble the whole case here, which to Cooler Master's credit is incredibly easy, but I would take not falling apart over easy any day of the week. Once we reassemble everything, as you'll see in B-roll and here, the case just has an overhang from the tempered glass where it's not flush. So we've got a couple millimeters here sticking out from the rest. So that just kind of bothers me. It's borderline nitpick, but it's just like, it makes the panel feel like it was a last minute, like, tempered glass is huge, we have to have it type of edition. I talked to them, tempered glass was apparently always in the design, so it's just kind of an oversight in that case. Not impressed with how wobbly it is, not impressed with how it secures and mounts, because it does really not secure at all, and really not happy with the fact that it's not flush like this. That's just kind of, you know, the argument for your case is it looks good and then you do this. Where does the argument go? It has to go somewhere else, like thermals, and it's not impressive enough to hold there on its own. So lots of small things here. Another problem, GPU clearance is also a problem. So we talked about this with the Thermaltake View 71 pretty heavily. It's only fair that we also do it for Cooler Master. And that problem is, if you have an MSI Gaming X Twin Frozer card, an EVGA FTW, an EVGA FTW Hybrid, an Asus ROG Strix, a Zotac Extreme Series card, or any number of other non-reference PCB cards that have a higher PCB, which is probably 50% of the cards we've reviewed in the last year, if not more. If you have one of those taller cards, it's taller than the PCIe slot, and you install an air cooler, even a small one like this 120mm cooler, they're not going to fit together. Or at least there's a very good chance they won't, unless the air cooler is pretty damn small. So you get away with a 92mm, but that's about it. So we have this mounted by zip ties right now, because that's the only way it would work. It will not mount properly, because obviously this is in the way. You don't get a PCIe ribbon cable included. You buy that separately. That's less of a problem because you don't need a mounting bracket or anything. You can actually mount it into the case without a bracket. That's nice, but not if it's a non-reference PCB that's tall. So this works best if you have a reference cooler, or a reference PCB rather, not necessarily cooler, although you'll see later that reference cooler is actually better. And works best if you do open loop liquid or something like that, which we didn't do, but that would have a smaller height for the video card. So yeah, that's kind of, it's a lot of really disappointing things with this case. And at $150, I haven't mentioned the price yet, that's what it is, 150 bucks, you kind of hope that they can get some of this stuff right, if not all of it. I mean, sure, Thermaltake overlooked this problem too, whatever. There's plenty of open loop options, there are plenty of reference PCBs, go get one of those. But then there's stuff like the panel mounting just being bad. I mean, look at that's so effortless for me to just kind of do that, and it's not necessary. At some point, the modularity isn't that required. It's not that needed that the case should be literally falling apart as I'm picking it up. And yes, you can obviously pick it up without things falling off. I would recommend doing it by grabbing under the power supply. Oh no, don't do that. That's actually bad. Don't pick it up that way. But no, you grab it under the power supply and then have your hand under the I/O. So that's what we need, is a guide to how to lift the case up. So yeah, a bit exaggerated for purposes of film, but I mean really, it's just, this panel should be secured. End of story. So yeah, let's go through the thermals. That'll get us through the rest of this case review. See how it does, if it follows the high airflow line at all, and then we'll wrap up. We didn't do anything too fancy for additional testing this time, just sort of functional vertical GPU mounting, for example, and taking the front panel off to see how much it limits the cooling potential. We plan to do more testing in the future though. We'll add comparative data next, as always, but we're first starting with only the H500P. This will give us a better understanding as to how the case performs under various conditions. With the stock configuration and under a torture workload, the H500P manages a CPU delta temperature of 56.1 Celsius over ambient, with idle at around 4 degrees Celsius, again over ambient. Removing the front panel entirely drops us down to 43.7 degrees, constituting the largest drop we've ever seen from this simple panel removal test. This tells us that the large 200mm fans have a lot more cooling potential than they're being afforded here. This is particularly noticeable as the resistance caused by the front panel is quite high, and causes the fan RPM to drop about 50 RPM over the on versus off test. Ignoring that aspect though, we can highlight that the front panel mesh, despite being about an inch wide, actually again only exposes less than half an inch of mesh to the fans. The fans therefore choke on this limited space and are already challenged in the static pressure department, as these large fans often are. Installing the GPU vertically drives up a bit more than 1 degree Celsius in our CPU measurements. This is partly because of the collision course between the CPU tower cooler and the video card, and is not really a realistic user scenario because you wouldn't be zip tying a card to your case. You'd probably just buy a smaller one or get a liquid cooler to account for the clearance issues. We'd expect this to be better under conditions of reference size PCBs. Comparatively, the Cooler Master H500P stock configuration lands at about 56.1 degrees Celsius CPU load temperature over ambient, positioning it between the Coleman enclosure and the NZXT S340 Elite. The S340 Elite is a case we previously knocked for mediocre ventilation, and so the H500P falls in that same line. Despite numerous references to high airflow and quotes in the case's review guide and elsewhere, the enclosure offers decidedly less airflow than the $70 Silverstone RL06, positioned at 48 degrees Celsius over ambient, or the Corsair 570X, which is similarly sized, even running at a slower 1050 RPM fan speed when the case is capable of more. This is even a bit worse than the Thermaltake View 71, which is at 54.7 degrees Celsius over ambient. The H500P doesn't impress in the slightest here, but isn't dismal either. It's just kind of okay. For any other case, that'd be, well, it'd be okay. But it's a disappointment on a case that clearly has the words high airflow attached to it, despite moving away from that branding officially. Moving on to GPU torture temperatures, the Twin Frozer card manages 54.9 degrees Celsius over ambient. That's in the stock configuration. This keeps it a couple degrees away from throttling, so it's actually not too bad when stock. Removing the front panel expectedly improves thermals, though only by 5 degrees Celsius for the GPU. The CPU impact was much greater. A vertical GPU mount suffocates our dual axial cooler on the card, which is pressed up against the glass and now has to deal with radiative heat off the back of the GPU trapped between the CPU cooler and itself. And this results in a 68 degrees Celsius over ambient temperature, pushing us well past thermal throttle territory and into frequency decay. Now, of course, this could be accounted for by blasting the GPU fan RPM and fixed, but then the noise argument goes out the window. You'd be best off with an open-loop GPU cooler, a hybrid card, or a reference card with a higher RPM. Comparatively, GPU torture testing lands the Cooler Master H500P stock configuration at 54.9 degrees Celsius, which is just between the 570X at its lower 1050 RPM, or again, stock 1550 lands at 51C, and the Be Quiet Dark Base Pro 900. The H500P is cooling the GPU about as well as cases that are targeted at silence, and at least that's in these workloads, and a lot of that is because of the power supply shroud, which is limiting airflow to a dual axial fan. Couple this with the fact that the GPU basically aligns with the dead zone on the 200mm fan despite the distance from the fan, and you end up with a bit of a warmer video card than would be desired. Moving on to 3D Mark stress testing, which represents a realistic gaming workload, we encounter GPU thermals of about 58.9 degrees Celsius on the H500P, right alongside the $50 Spec 04 and Thermaltake G21, which is 50 to 70 depending on where you buy it. To its credit, CPU thermals are a lot better here at 30.7 Celsius versus 36 and 39 on the two aforementioned cases. This is because the GPU being butted against Cooler Master's PSU shroud is again limiting the airflow, particularly with that dead zone consideration. CPU thermals position the case between the KL07 and C700P ultimately. Testing Blender for a realistic production application, our CPU worker rendering test positions the H500P CPU thermals as acceptable at about 39 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient. That's because this test generates less heat than some of the gaming workloads. That's down to GPU utilization, which is 0% in a CPU worker Blender test. The H500P still isn't impressive, but it is in the middle of the pack and is perfectly acceptable. As for GPU thermals with the GPU worker in Blender, where the CPU load is minimized, we're again objectively in non-thermally threatened territory. We're not going to throttle, but we're still middle of the pack. The H500P lands between the Dark Base Pro 900 once again and the Meshify C from Fractal. Surely then the noise should be better in this case, as its larger fans do spin slower than the whinier fans of 120mm and 140mm sizes. In our standardized noise testing, the Cooler Master H500P lands at 38.7 dBA system noise, so just before the jump into truly high airflow configurations that generate 40 dBA plus of noise. That makes the H500P about the same in acoustic performance as the Meshify C, given our configuration with the same test system, and it's really just not impressive, but not bad either. So that pretty much wraps this up. The case isn't the worst case anyone's ever made. It's just that at $150 and with the amount of hype it's received, it's pretty disappointing. This is what happens when a case receives the amount of hype as a piece of silicon, and then the company ends up going cheap on some of the components. So part of this is Cooler Master's attempt to stick to a modular design. They've gone a bit too hard with it here. It's cool to be modular, but there's a reason that basically no one else does it in the market. And while it would be great for Cooler Master to capitalize on that empty market, they need to do it in a way that makes people actually want to buy the modularity and then trust it. And yes, the removal of the panels was a little bit of a problem. It's not the worst thing in the world. I maybe made it seem a little exaggerated, but I mean, again, the first time you pick the thing up, if you grab by the side of the front panel at all, it genuinely will just kind of pull off. It's not the best mounting mechanism, but to be fair, it's probably not as bad as we made it look initially. It is about that bad the first time you work with it though. This panel isn't too much of a problem. You just don't grab it by the back and it's not going to come off. But ultimately, ignoring the panel mounting issues, which I've demonstrated primarily for Cooler Master's benefit to try and convince them to put an alligator clip somewhere, the next issue with the panels is just the cheapness and the creakiness of it. The creakiness, again, it's one of those things where like you're not going to sit there and push on the panel while you're using the system, but it just speaks audibly to the quality of materials, which is not that high. So yeah, disappointed in a lot of ways. Wobbly tempered glass panel, not particularly secure. There's like a 0.5 millimeter gap between the glass and the chassis. The fans don't get a lot of airflow through the mesh of the front panel because of how the fans protrude from the front of the case. GPU clearance doesn't work with taller video cards, and I think that's most of it. On the upside, the cable management's pretty good, and I guess it has a look that a lot of people like. So if you like the case and how it looks, we're not going to tell you to buy something else because really not much else exists that looks like this case. It's fairly unique in that aspect, and Cooler Master's done well there. It's also $150, and you need to go into it knowing that there are some build quality issues in terms of quality materials and components, but once you have it built, it's going to look the way it looks, and that's the end of the story. You're not going to be taking it apart every day. That said, some aspects will always be in your way, like the non-flush side panel and the limited airflow, so you're going to need to plan for those in the build. But yeah, it's just, you know, look, this is, again, not as offensively bad a case as some of the others we've reviewed in the past. It's just that at this price point, at this level of marketing with the specific language used, with how the case came together ultimately, it's just disappointing. And that's all there is to it. So hopefully the price comes down a bit because at maybe $120, somewhere around there, it'd be reasonably competitive, even with the quality control issues and concerns. But at $150, there's too much good competition for us to give it a hard recommendation unless you're buying strictly on looks alone. And that's where it stands. So as always, if you like this type of coverage, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. You can also go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one or our Graph logo shirt. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.